Well, we hope you all have had a good break then, and welcome back to this live stream 2 then, as we continue our discussion around life insurance then, and certainly different elements of it. Indeed, that break sponsored and brought to you by HELLIG then. Thank you so much for that sponsorship. We do have 2 half-hour-long presentations that are coming through as well over the next moment or two. We will, however, only have one in this live stream that we will focus on. But without further ado, though, Memory, we're going to get into should we tax the anti-vax? I'm not sure how this conversation is going to go, but we do have Pamela HELLIG who joins us now, and we're going to talk about the ethical and other considerations of using vaccination history as a rating factor in life insurance underwriting. Seems complicated, but Pamela, hopefully you can make it easy.
I'll try my best.
Good morning, Pamela. How are you?
Hi, Memory. Good, and you?
It's splendid to see you, that's for sure.
You too.
Fantastic.
Only could be in person.
Yeah, that certainly will come. Pam, we'll cross straight on over to you then for this presentation.
Thank you. Good. How does it make you feel when I say the words group project? Now, I can't see you, but I can almost feel the visceral negative reactions that this phrase evokes. Perhaps you're having flashbacks to the night before your standard 9 physics task was due, and you're scrambling to get everything done because one person in the group didn't pull their weight. Sometimes I think the point of these group projects wasn't to teach us about the topic, but rather to impart the lesson that life isn't fair, and sometimes the actions and decisions of other people affect us and our lives. The thing with group projects is that usually you could compensate for the lazy person and still get a decent mark. And usually group projects weren't a matter of life and death. In the real world, however, sometimes you can't compensate for the actions and decisions of other people. And sometimes these things are a matter of life and death. Let's take vaccination, for example. Now, the South African government offers a very progressive and generous vaccination program, which means that all of these 11 vaccines are available to South African children for free. Despite that, however, childhood vaccination is not mandated by law in South Africa, so that means each person has the right to choose whether or not they vaccinate themselves and their children. And while everyone's entitled to make that choice, is it really fair to those who do get vaccinated and to those who, for medical reasons, can't get vaccinated? Because when someone chooses not to get vaccinated, whether it's because they're actively against the idea or just because they're indifferent, and that person gets sick, they don't just affect themselves. They make vulnerable members of the community sick. They put a strain on the healthcare system. They leave their families and their places of work in the lurch, and they worsen the claims experience of insurance companies. Doesn't seem fair, does it? And while group projects taught us that life isn't fair, surely underwritten insurance exists to make life a little bit fairer. I mean, we don't expect non-smokers who don't participate in extreme sports to pay the same premiums as smokers who regularly skydive. So why should those who get themselves vaccinated subsidize those who choose not to? Now, this idea of premium discrimination based on vaccination status isn't something new. Let's go back in time to the turn of the previous century. Smallpox was rampant throughout the globe, from Kenya, where entire tribes were being wiped out, to the UK, where scenes like this were not uncommon. This photo shows, it was taken in 1901 in England, and it shows 2 boys who were both exposed to the smallpox virus. Only one of them had been vaccinated. I'll let you guess which one. So with scenes like this being not uncommon, it's no surprise that many insurance companies at the time did discriminate against applicants who did not get themselves vaccinated against smallpox. This is an excerpt from the 8th of April 1899 edition of the British Medical Journal. And this article sets out the results of a survey in which British insurance companies were asked how they treated non-vaccinated applicants. The authors recognized in doing this research that the potential impact of the public not getting vaccinated against smallpox was material enough to affect claims experience and hence the funds available for future benefit payouts. The 69 respondents were grouped into 8 different classes depending on how they treated these non-vaccinated applicants, with the top 3 classes being, surprise, surprise, loading premiums, declining the applications altogether, and excluding smallpox-related deaths from the contract. Seems reasonable enough and probably not too different from how we underwrite today. So let's fast forward 120 years. It is now mid-2019. Smallpox has been officially eradicated for almost 4 decades. Cape Town has just narrowly avoided day 0. We're all super excited for the upcoming Rugby World Cup in Japan. And the word corona conjures up nothing more than images of beach parties and hangovers. Oh, it was a simpler time. We were fortunate enough to be living in a world that wasn't governed by the tyranny of infectious disease. Diseases couldn't tell us where to go, or indeed where not to go, who to see, what to wear, the parameters of our interactions with one another, or how to share a Zol. We were living a life of privilege, and that privilege was largely afforded to us by one of the greatest medical interventions in human history, the vaccine. And then 2020 rolled around and said, wait, guys, hold my beer, my corona, and watch this. Now, this talk is not about COVID-19, but the fact that we are living through this pandemic shines a spotlight on an issue which has been around for a long time and which is only going to become more important in the future. Given the global scramble towards a COVID-19 vaccine, the public is more receptive than it's been in decades to the benefits of vaccines and vaccination coverage, which makes it a good time to ask the question, should we, as the insurance industry, tax the anti-vax? Should we follow the principles of fair premium pricing and the example of our 19th century counterparts and load, decline, or exclude those who choose not to get vaccinated? In the interest of fairness, should we really be expecting that vaccinated people subsidize the preventable morbidity and mortality expenses that people rack up from not being vaccinated? Bizarrely, the suggestion that we should charge different premiums based on the increased morbidity and mortality risk of not getting vaccinated is a controversial statement. Despite being one of the most effective public health achievements of all time, cited by numerous credible sources, as over the last few decades, as the number of available vaccines has increased, so too have the number of individuals who are anti-vax or suspicious or fearful of particular vaccines or vaccination schedules. And the problem with this is that we rely on large-scale take-up in the community for vaccination to be effective. And so it becomes a social issue. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the term of herd immunity. Basically, it says that if enough people in the community are vaccinated or immunized in some other way, they're able to protect the vulnerable members of the community and thus contain the disease. So when I say we should consider incorporating vaccination history into our underwriting processes, it's not just because I believe in the principles of fair premium pricing. It's also because I believe that the insurance industry, as an influential and a trusted provider of a social good, has the ethical duty to encourage positive behavior within its markets. This is especially true in a country like South Africa, a society which so cherishes the concepts of community and togetherness that the norm Ubuntu has even been referenced in decisions made by the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in the land. It's also something that Judge Sachs mentioned to us yesterday, which just emphasizes how important this term is. Desmond Tutu was talking about Ubuntu, but he might as well have been speaking about vaccinations when he said, "We think of ourselves far too frequently as just individuals separated from one another, whereas you are connected and what you do affects the whole world." Because when you get vaccinated, you don't just protect yourself, you protect other patients, vulnerable people around you, your family, the economy, health workers, and the population at large. So my paper was about the practical and ethical considerations of incorporating vaccination history as a rating factor in life insurance underwriting. But I'm sure there are some skeptics in the audience. So before I get into those factors, I'd like to spend some time trying to convince you that this is an idea worth considering by dispelling 5 common myths around vaccines and vaccination schedules in the 21st century. Myth number 1, vaccines are harmful. Now, if you're a follower of and a believer in mainstream science, you'll know that vaccines are not only not harmful, but they're incredibly effective. And studies that have sought to prove otherwise have often been found to be bogus or fraudulent. So where does this anti-vax movement come from, and why does it still persist? Perhaps the most famous origin story of the anti-vax movement is that of Andrew Wakefield. He was a British gastroenterologist, and in 1998, he published a paper linking the mumps, measles, and rubella, or MMR vaccine, to autism. After 10 years of investigation and controversy, Wakefield was found guilty of ethical, scientific, and medical misconduct, and the data upon which he based his paper were found to be fraudulent. But the damage had been done, the anti-vax movement had taken off, and although Wakefield lost his medical license, he gained a large following and a supermodel girlfriend. And speaking of celebrities, the anti-vax movement has no doubt been helped along by the very vocal support of a number of B and C list Hollywood celebrities, because we all know that celebrities are experts on medical things. So this anti-vax movement has threatened to undo centuries of good work, and we're seeing the resurgence of diseases which were virtually eradicated before, both in pockets of Western society and around the world. So what is it that makes something that seems not rational persist and grow, and why is the anti-vax movement still continuing today? And perhaps it has to do with the fact that the human mind isn't 100% rational. We are susceptible to certain cognitive biases and phobias, which influence our behavior. And perhaps the most applicable bias in this case is called the omission bias, which states that individuals are far more averse to the actions of doing something, taking an action, going out and getting vaccinated, than they are to the consequences of inaction. So doing nothing and staying susceptible to these diseases. So people don't want to take responsibility for their actions. And this is particularly applicable for vaccination because vaccines are usually administered to healthy individuals as prophylactics. The benefits of getting vaccinated are by definition invisible. Nothing's going to happen to you. Whereas the risks, whether they be real or speculated, are very visible. Also, the decision to go out and get vaccinated is irreversible. The opposite is not true. Perhaps the most famous parent to succumb to the omission bias was American founding father Benjamin Franklin. In 1736, he lost his 4-year-old son to smallpox because he hadn't been vaccinated. He wrote in his autobiography, "This I mention for the sake of the parents who omit that operation on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example, showing that the regret may be the same either way, and that therefore the safer should be chosen." Myth number 2. Vaccines are not as important as they used to be. If this were the case, then as new vaccines were being developed, we'd eradicate these diseases one by one, and everyone would be healthy and we wouldn't have these horrible diseases anymore. Unfortunately, the opposite is likely to be true. Vaccines are likely just to become more important as time goes on for various reasons. So just to revisit the measles example, this graph kind of shows the evolution of measles over the years. In 2000, the US declared this disease eradicated. Unfortunately, that was around the time the Wakefield paper came out, and the anti-vax movement took off. In 2014, there was an outbreak in Disney World, and in 2018, 140,000 people around the world died of measles. Most of these were children. That's quite a lot for a disease which should have been eradicated. And it shows what happens the moment we take our foot off the vaccination pedal. So not only are vaccines going to assist in preventing diseases directly, they're also going to help indirectly in the fight against antibiotic resistance. As you can see, this graph shows how antibiotic resistance has shot up in recent decades, and that exponential trend is set to continue. So when antibiotics are no longer effective against diseases, vaccines are going to be our only option. It's going to be a case of prevention being better than no cure. And that's not only true for diseases which are directly preventable by vaccines. Being vaccinated against certain diseases also makes you less susceptible to super infections and opportunistic infections that you get when you are already sick with something else and your immune system is low. So for example, with COVID-19, we don't have a vaccine yet, obviously, but if you did have your flu shot and your pneumonia vaccine chopped up and you did land up in hospital with COVID, at least you wouldn't be getting other infections and sicknesses, and in that way it can really help to reduce the impact of things like COVID. Myth number 3, everybody is vaccinated in childhood. If this were the case, I guess I wouldn't have a story, because we'd all be vaccinated and there wouldn't actually be a discernible unvaccinated population within the insurance pool. Unfortunately, childhood vaccination rates are much lower than you would think they are. And perhaps we don't think this because we might live in filter bubbles where we're vaccinated. We assume everyone we know is vaccinated. But let's look at some of the numbers. So a number of years ago, the World Health Organization set up a global action plan in which a lot of countries, including South Africa, committed to achieving a 90% childhood vaccination rate by the year 2020. This graph is from a report that they published in 2017 to outline their progress, and it shows the top 10 countries for under-vaccination for diphtheria. South Africa is right up there, only 66% childhood vaccination coverage. Our goal at that time had been 92%. Unfortunately, these kind of trends extend to other vaccines as well and haven't improved since 2017. In fact, just a few months ago in June, Musonge Mahashe et al. Published a paper in which they said, not only has South Africa failed to reach internationally set vaccination coverage targets, locally set targets also remain unachieved. There are already indications of reemergence of diphtheria, pertussis, which is whooping cough, and measles in some parts of the country. So we may, again, due to our filter bubbles, think that this 34 to 40% of unvaccinated children are perhaps from communities that are less privileged, who don't have access to the resources and education that we might have had. But that's also not always the case. And to bring this a little bit closer to home, I'm going to mention a few case studies today. All these case studies are courtesy of my resident medical expert, who happens to be my mother. She is a family physician who's practiced for almost 40 years. And she's also currently completing her master's degree in bioethics and the ethics of mandating childhood vaccination. So she has a special interest in this field. She told me the story of a patient who came to her about 20 years ago, a pregnant woman in her early 30s. Pregnant women are especially susceptible to diseases and so on, so they are considered a vulnerable group. For whatever reason, she hadn't been vaccinated against MMR when she was a child. When she got pregnant, she contracted rubella. When the baby was born, he was born blind, deaf, and physically disabled. That baby is about 20 years old now, and for the rest of his life, he'll have to live in permanent healthcare facilities. All this pain, misfortune, and expense could have been avoided with a simple vaccination. Myth number 4. Vaccination is only important for children. I think this is quite a common one. And perhaps this focus on childhood immunization programs and so on stems from the fact that when these programs were being set up, the population might have been skewed more towards children, so there was a focus on that. Or perhaps it's because children are easier to reach through their primary healthcare contact, so it's more cost effective to roll out programs to children. But whatever the reason is, the fact remains that there's been significant underinvestment in adult vaccination and vaccination education for decades. And it shows in the numbers. So if we think childhood vaccination coverage is low, adult vaccination coverage is even lower. So in the US, between 1,000 and 3,000 children die every year of vaccine-preventable diseases, compared to 50 to 70,000 adults. So it's clear where the real burden of these diseases lies. And I think what many people don't realize is even if they were vaccinated as children, these vaccines do tend to wear off over time. So you do need booster shots. You need to get revaccinated for some of these diseases. Another thing that we forget is that since we were children, the science has moved on. There are now vaccines available that weren't included in our childhood vaccination programs. For example, the HPV or human papillomavirus vaccine. So apart from the child prodigies in the audience, we all would have missed this as children because it was only rolled out in public schools in South Africa in the year 2014. Now, HPV is a virus which has many strains, and the most aggressive strains lead directly to cancer of the cervix, which is the #1 cancer killer in women in South Africa. And the fact that we all miss these vaccines has real impacts. And again, I'd like to just bring some case studies in to illustrate this. Another pregnant woman, this time also about 20 years ago. This lady was in her late 20s and she was 6 months pregnant and came to the doctor for a routine pap smear. The results showed abnormal cells. And at that time, we couldn't check if those cells were specifically HPV. So I don't know what happened. I assume the gynecologist took a wait and see approach, wanted to make sure everything was fine with the baby. There wasn't really much they could do. 3 months later, the baby was born healthily. 3 months after that, the woman was back at her doctor and was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer of the cervix. After 6 months of pain, suffering, and a very traumatic illness, she died, leaving a a very heartbroken family and a small baby behind. So, of course, the HPV vaccine could have prevented that. But what's also changed in the last 20 years is that now we have a test that can test specifically for HPV in abnormal cells. But this also isn't the answer. And I'd like to bring another example here. This is actually from recently, a few weeks ago. My mom saw two patients a few weeks apart, again, young women in their 20s and 30s who came in for routine pap smears. As a matter of course, my mom sends off for this HPV test, but it is not standard. It's expensive. Your medical aid probably won't pay for it. People don't know about it, so it's not something that gets done regularly. But this was done for these two patients, and it was found that they both had HPV 16, which is the most aggressive strain of HPV. And it's basically a one-way ticket to cancer of the cervix. So while it's positive that it was picked up, the treatment for this is extensive, it's long-term, it's very invasive, and worst of all, it's possibly futile. In addition to this, just by the way, if these women were to now apply for life insurance products or critical illness policies, things like that, they would be excluded for cancer of the cervix. So we've spoken about children, we've spoken about young people, but one part of the population that everyone tends to ignore is the older population. And there's this kind of perception, both in the medical community and the population at large, that the lives of older people are somehow less valuable than those of younger people. And we've seen this with COVID as well, I think, this attitude towards older people. And I think it's because they say that the death of an older person from something like pneumonia may be considered unfortunate and inevitable to an extent, while the death of a child from the same disease is a tragedy. So not only is this thinking inhumane, I mean, these people are our parents, our grandparents, leaders of the community, but it also ignores the fact that when old people get sick, they get very sick. Their treatment is usually more long-term, it's more intensive, and it takes up a lot more resources. So it's also worth considering, encouraging older people to make sure their vaccines are topped up, so that not only do they ensure a longer life and a better quality of life, but they also don't use up healthcare resources that could be used for something that truly is unpreventable. Myth number 5, vaccine preventable diseases don't have a financial impact on insurance companies. Now, insurance companies aren't charitable organizations. We can't just add rating factors because we think it's the right thing to do. It also has to make financial sense. So my paper wasn't a technical work. It was, more of a thought experiment into this idea. So I didn't focus on statistical and mathematical investigations, but I wanted to have some kind of ballpark figure and put a monetary value on what these diseases are costing us every year. So to calculate an estimate of a mortality cost, I looked at the deadliest vaccine preventable diseases in South Africa and multiplied the number of deaths every year by an assumed vaccine efficacy rate. And this very rough back of the envelope calculation gave me a number of around 50,000 preventable deaths in South Africa every year. So to add a cost to that, I multiplied this number by a CSIS estimate of the average South African earners life insurance cover, which is 600,000 Rand. And that gave me a total cost of around 30 billion Rand, which is nothing to sneeze at. But wait, there's more. Before someone dies of a vaccine preventable disease, they get sick and they need medical treatment. And we all know how expensive medical treatment is, which is why we take out critical illness policies and lump sum disability policies and things like that. So I also wanted to try and quantify the healthcare costs that the insurance industry is paying every year. Very rough calculation. I looked at the data which was most readily available, which was in the US, which said that they pay $27 billion every year on treating vaccine preventable diseases. If I adjust it for population size and exchange rate, it gets me a morbidity bill of more or less 80 billion rand. And just to put that number in perspective, 80 billion rand is what we as a country spend on old age grants every year. It's more than the 50 billion rand we spend on state security and defense. So even if the true numbers are just a fraction of these estimates I came up with, it's still quite a significant amount, and it's preventable. And, again, even if all these people aren't part of the insured population, someone's treating them. And when NHI comes into force, it's definitely something that the actuaries involved will need to think about, because someone has to pay this. So I hope by now I've convinced you that this is an idea at least worth considering. And if we were to consider incorporating vaccination history as a rating factor in our underwriting processes, we need to think about various things, including practical considerations and ethical considerations. So on a practical front, if I'm going to be conservative, I'll say that this factor is not likely to affect standard rates. It probably won't have as significant an impact as something like age or sex or smoking, in which case we could probably follow the example of those 1899 insurance companies and include this factor as perhaps an exclusion clause or a loading or something like that, which means that we wouldn't have to disrupt our whole pricing and underwriting systems. We wouldn't have to develop new mortality tables, which would make it a much less disruptive and expensive factor to incorporate. So where could we get ideas on how to implement this? We could look at what's already being done. And the closest thing I could find was Discovery's Vitality program, which offers its members points based on whether or not they've been vaccinated against a specific list of diseases. So a program like this could really tell us how to collect evidence, so how to prove whether or not someone's been vaccinated, which vaccines should be included in scope, because some will be more effective, will get more bang for our buck, so to speak, than others. And most importantly, it can tell us how effective these programs are. So do these incentives towards positive behavior, which we call nudges, do they really have an impact on people's behavior? So does promising someone cheaper flights or coffees or whatever Vitality does encourage people to go out and get vaccinated? Then, of course, any PR person will tell you you'll need to think of marketing message as well, because this is a bit of a controversial topic. And as was done with smoking, when that was introduced as a rating factor a few decades ago, the focus would very much be on the preferential rates that non-smokers or vaccinated people would receive versus the more punitive rates that smokers and non-vaccinated people would get. Then we'd also need to consult with stakeholders. In this case, it would be the board, senior management, policymakers. And we could also even think about consulting with government and see if there is a way to kind of synergize with what they're already doing or ideas that they might have and how the insurance industry might assist. And that kind of links to this educational aspect that we'd want to capitalize on, perhaps use this idea to close that knowledge gap that currently exists between for adult vaccinations. And it kind of reminds me of one of the themes of this convention is how to kind of capitalize and build on that private-public partnership. And this might be a way to do it. So I don't think there are any major, obvious, practical obstructions to implementing this idea. Now, we are actuaries and we're bound by certain ethical codes, which means that if we were to include a rating factor, we'd also want to make sure it's ethical. And how do we know if a rating factor is ethical? Because underwritten insurance, by definition, is discrimination. We charge different rates based on people's behavior and characteristics. So the fact that it's discriminatory in itself doesn't make it unethical. The question is that discrimination fair? And there have been a number of actuaries within our society who have come up with frameworks for measuring these ethical or these rating factors against, and I looked at some of those. The first one is the Fair Discrimination Report, which was put together by Kruger et al., actually for a convention a few years ago. And they set out criteria for assessing the appropriateness and necessity for using a particular rating factor. So, sorry, I believe I'm getting messages that I need to wrap up. Memory, and do I still have time?
So unfortunately, we have actually run out of time there, Pamela. So it is a little bit difficult. But I think some of the questions might be able to be things that you could expand on. We'll take a few questions as well then to just perhaps get us through some of this. I believe HELLIG as well joins us for this part as well. And that's, I mean, you've used quite a bit of the examples your mother's had with regards to this and how this has, played out, particularly in her life. Shelley, perhaps let's get just very quickly some thoughts from you with regards to, your daughter's assumptions that have been made through this and your lived experience.
Good morning, and firstly just to say how honored I am to be amongst the esteemed speakers I've heard today. Secondly of all, I just want to declare I have no conflict of interest. And thirdly, any references will be available on request. So I think the bottom line that I'd like to just bring forward is that it's never been more important to be vaccinated. Number one, we're in the middle of a deadly pandemic. Number two, we cannot make you better anymore as doctors because antibiotics are not working. We're approaching an era where antibiotics are becoming defunct. Number three, we have pretty much nearly 8 million immune-compromised persons in our society who have got no defense against such infections. So that kind of pretty much wraps up what I'd like to say about how important it is.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that as well, Shelley. So great to actually get even those words, I think, overall become very, very critical and important. Memory, I know you certainly have quite a few questions that have come up there as well.
Ooh, girl. I didn't know how right I was to warn the gentlemen when they join the AWC sessions that they must be prepared because they're amongst warriors. Because this topic is certainly got people talking. Some of these comments, I'm not even sure I should be reading them out, but well done to you for picking this topic. Yeah, it's a little bit challenging for me because some of these comments really, I'm not sure if they're adding to the conversation, but it's nice to see the dialogue between actuaries. Some of them are for, some of them are against. So I'll just get to the first statement to say, by Anonymous, to say, I agree that vaccines are not harmful and the benefits are massive. So let's stop perpetuating this myth. And of course, there are certain people who disagree with it based on some of the comments that I've seen in the group. But the first question is from Bevshan. How easy is it to find out if someone has been vaccinated? Would we be relying on the possibly elderly parent's memory or a vaccination certificate that might be difficult to obtain?
Yeah, so I've just gotten a message that the organizers made a mistake. So I should be able to continue with my presentation. Is that right?
2.
And I'll answer that question in the presentation. Okay. So, yeah, apologies, everyone. I think the organizers were confused there. But so I was speaking about the ethical considerations of using vaccination history as a rating factor and looking at a few of these frameworks that we can work from. And I will get to that question, don't worry. So Kruger et al. Wrote this report in which they asked the following 4 questions, and these are things we can rate our rating factors against. So the first one is responsibility and influence, then awareness. Are there alternative risk rating factors that are available? And then acceptability and public opinion. So if I just go through each of those quickly and rate vaccination history against each of them. So firstly, are people partly responsible for and do they have influence over this factor? So as children, we might not have had influence over whether or not our parents vaccinated. But as adults, I'd say we definitely have responsibility. So the thing with vaccinations is, as I said before, they do wear off over time. So it's mostly harmless and often beneficial to get revaccinated as a grown-up. So even if your childhood medical records are lost, which for most of us they probably are, there's no reason not to get vaccinated as an adult, which means you do have influence over this factor. Linked to this, is the applicant aware of the underwriting condition? So yes, again, if you don't want to get revaccinated, there are certain diseases for which you can do antibody tests and check whether you have immunity that way. I also interpreted this question as, is the applicant aware of the condition contractually? So when they're signing up for this, are they aware of this factor? And that would be, of course, up to the insurance company to make sure that all their terms and conditions are clear. And again, really focus on that education message. Then, do alternative risk rating factors exist that are more acceptable? I'd say no, to such an extent that the beauty of this factor is that it is so binary. You've either been vaccinated or you haven't. It's objective, and I can't imagine a more acceptable rating factor to kind of rate the risk of getting sick from a vaccine-preventable disease. In fact, this factor might be a good proxy for other factors which are currently being used to rate health status in general. And then, is the risk factor considered inappropriate by society? So I guess this is the big question. I'd say the majority of South Africans probably aren't anti-vax. Again, that might be my filter bubble talking. Then I saw an article actually a few weeks ago in the Business Insider, which said that 64% of South Africans would take a COVID-19 vaccine. So if it's only 64%, if a global pandemic doesn't show us the importance of vaccination, I don't know what will. But it's still a majority. So for now, I'm going to say that we meet that criterion. Then I also looked at Francois Mouret's fair discrimination principle. He's also an actuary with ASSA, and he presented this at the convention last year, his paper. And he says that a specific underwriting factor for premium discrimination between insurance applicants is justifiable and fair if it meets the following 3 criteria. So, number 1, the statistical evidence to support the discrimination must be strong and reliable. The allocation of each applicant to a risk group must be unambiguous. And the effect of the factor on mortality must have a reasonable causal explanation. So, again, quickly going through those 3. As I said, my work wasn't a technical paper, so I haven't done statistical tests on the insured population. I can't say for sure that there is a strong difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. But hopefully, the idea would be supported enough that this wouldn't be such an important factor. Then the allocation must be unambiguous. Again, vaccination history is it's a binary objective measure. So either you're vaccinated or you're not vaccinated. So it's unambiguous. And then the effect of the factor on mortality must have a reasonable causal explanation. So there's a whole world of research and literature that's been built up over hundreds of years to kind of prove that vaccines are effective and do prevent disease and death. So I would rely on the work done by scientists over centuries to support me on that one. So if I look at these kind of frameworks that have been put into place, it doesn't seem like there are any obvious ethical barriers to including this factor. And then just quickly, something else I wanted to mention for interest's sake is the link to digitalization of medical records. So in the UK, we're already seeing insurance companies using more and more digital medical records instead of relying on paper-based records. And this is eventually, I guess, the South African insurance industry will need to catch up as well. And that kind of brings up a whole new ethical question as to how we should treat these digital medical records. So there's an expert in the UK called Duncan Minty who is doing work on the ethics of underwriting and the ethics of using digital medical records. And I think if we were to include vaccination history as a rating factor would be a good touchstone, because it is kind of a clear, cut and dried factor, and it doesn't really require much interpretation. So he says that the ingredients of trustworthiness that we need to ensure that we are treating these medical records ethically are competency, reliability, honesty, and goodwill. Basically saying, is the insured person benefiting from this use of digitalization as much as the insurance company is? So that's just something to think about when digitalization becomes a reality in our insurance industry. So in summary, I think I've shown the importance of vaccination, the fact that it's important from childhood to old age and will only become more important as time goes on. The fact that there is a potentially significant financial burden of under-vaccination, and there aren't any obvious practical ethical barriers to incorporating this factor. So I guess the question is, what next? If an insurance company does think it's a good idea to go ahead, of course, they'd need to do their own cost-benefit analysis and decide in what form they'd want to introduce this idea. But I really think that the benefits, in particular the social benefits, would outweigh the costs of introducing it. And then as actuaries, how do we act when we're faced with this choice to do something that can really have a positive impact on society? And I'm reminded of the quote by Hillel the Elder, who said, "If not us, who? If not now, when?" And in this digital age of social media, influencers, and cancel culture, it's the public, especially the generation that's going to rebuild the post-COVID-19 world, is more aware than they've been in decades or ever of the social responsibility that big corporations have. So perhaps that makes now, while the world waits with bated breath for a COVID-19 vaccine, the right time to be thinking about how the insurance industry can play its part in the drive towards global vaccination coverage. And it makes here, South Africa, with our historically sky-high rates of infectious disease, our traditionally innovative insurance industry, and our unsinkable spirit of Ubuntu, the right place to do it. I don't know if we have time for questions now, but you're welcome to contact me via email. I'll also be at the MBE booth in the exhibition stand, or contact me via the app.
Pamela, thank you so much for that. Just to, of course, just reiterate that we had gotten note that it was going to end at 10:30, but we're so glad we did actually extend it and continue the conversation to around 11 o'clock. So we still do have time even for even more questions, which is of great benefit as well to this conversation on the whole. Thank you so much for that as well then. I know that there are still a few questions and a whole lot of people saying,
Sure.
give her the time, let her finish. And we certainly did try to do that. And I hope you're all happy and satisfied, so to speak.
I think well done, Pamela. I think in stream 2, this is the most comments and questions we've received throughout this convention. To that end, I'm going to put on, since I'm wearing my underpants and they're duct taped to my waist, I'll read this statement, but because it's received the most comment. And Anonymous says, and just to give context, somebody made a comment that vaccines are tested on aborted babies, and I think this is where this comment is coming from. And the comment says, I can't believe there are actuaries such as Anonymous posting a 1016, posting such idiotic statements regarding abortion. So I did read it out because it received a lot of likes, but I think for me, we are engaging each other, and it's very important that we engage in a professional manner with a mutual respect. But I did read it out, so going forward, hopefully we can maintain that professionalism in our comments. So I think a lot of people have said well done, so well done to you, Pamela, and I think once you go into your MBA booth, you might receive a lot more comments and a lot more questions. Bevshin's question was answered, I think. In terms of the next question, how significant is the anti-vax movement in South Africa?
I'm going to refer to my mom in this case.
Yes, we don't have figures, unfortunately. But it's suffice to say that there are enough who cause things like the measles outbreaks we've seen recently. And yeah, I don't have actual figures, unfortunately, in South Africa. But it's a worldwide phenomenon.
I myself actually met somebody who hasn't vaccinated their child for the first time this year. I didn't believe it until now, this talk, and given how emotive it has been. So just going to the next question, is it fair to discriminate against children for decisions made by their parents?
So I guess we aren't discriminating against children. My research was really about the insured population, which is, it's a good point, because the whole point is that as adults, we do have the power and the influence to make our own decisions. If we miss out on vaccinations as children, we can get them as adults. So yeah, the point is to not discriminate against children who didn't have the choice.
The next one is a statement by Jean Lawaskakni, and he says, I don't believe we should be amplifying the cowardice of anonymous comments by giving them airtime in a Q&A after the session. I think you're probably right in that respect, and I think that's why I had reservations about reading out that comment. But I think because we are a profession, it's quite important that we engage in a professional manner and respect each other's comments, even if we do disagree. Rob Rasconi asks, what is holding insurers back? Usually they jump at an opportunity at competitive advantage through an additional rating factor. Is it not a significant factor, or are insurers afraid of standing out?
You know, that question is exactly what led me to do all this research. And as I've been speaking to chief medical officers of a few insurers, and people have been involved in pricing and underwriting their whole lives, and I couldn't find a satisfying answer, which is why I'm keen to pursue this idea. But perhaps many people haven't thought about it. There is that myth that vaccination isn't important for adults, and everyone gets, those myths about childhood vaccination. So people probably don't think it is an issue. And then, of course, there's, not wanting to offend people who choose not to vaccinate. And if I can just make a quick statement on that, I think, as insurance companies and actuaries, we work within certain legal and ethical constraints. And we have very good laws to tell us, how not to discriminate and to make sure everyone's treated fairly, and we promote equality and so on. So we can never make everyone happy, but we can try our best to work within the legal and ethical constraints. So I was trying with this research to show that, there aren't actually significant legal, or there aren't any legal, but there aren't significant ethical barriers to implementing this rating factor.
Anonymous says, I'm fascinated by the misinformation out there, which is playing itself out here in an educated actuaries Q&A list. It seems that a small piece of information someone reads becomes their reality and their frame of reference without thinking. How can we get around that in the vaccination debate?
Oh, gosh, it's a good question. And I'll let my mom also add to it. But I guess it comes down to education. And just, as I said, the focus has been on childhood vaccination, but perhaps we could also focus on educating adults. It does become difficult in this age of fake news. It becomes difficult to distinguish what is a credible source and what isn't. Well, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So the research does show that the most important area where people where people make decisions is with their health practitioner. So I think there's a lot of emphasis, and the burden should be on us, as health practitioners, to persuade our population of patients of the importance of vaccination. Just to reiterate what Pamela said earlier, it's that most of the childhood vaccinations wear off in adults. That's the first thing. The second thing is there is no danger whatsoever in being revaccinated. And thirdly, the second, the adult vaccines that are available now would go a long way in preventing some of the top causes of mortality in adults in South Africa.
Sure.
Thank you. The next question says, there are also direct future costs on the health system for electing not to get a vaccine, and this becomes even more prevalent during a pandemic. What are your thoughts of having this mandated by governments or other legal bodies?
I think that's a very good question, and one very close to my heart. I'm busy doing research into the ethics involved in mandating childhood vaccination in South Africa. Already in more than 40 countries in Europe, this is the case. And the only thing that seems to be holding people back, in fact, are the ethical considerations. And if one has to analyze and tease this out, I think there's absolutely no doubt that that should be mandated. The big ethical argument is usually paternalism. But if you look at any law anywhere in the world, it has to be in essence paternalistic. So you can't. So I'm not sure that that's a convincing argument.
I think the last perhaps statement before we go on to the break is by Simon, and Simon says, I'm not convinced of using insurance as a means to effect social change. First, I'm not sure it is right. Second, I'm not sure how effective it would be for something population-wide like vaccination. Sorry, let me reread that. Second, I'm not sure how effective it would be for something population-wide like vaccination. Third, there could be unintended consequences. Do you agree with that statement? Do you have anything to add?
I'd be interested to know what the unintended consequences he has in mind are. And yes, sure, we won't perhaps be able to reach the whole population, but even if we can reach the insured population and work with government to, almost leapfrog this idea into something more population-wide, I think it would be useful. As to the point about our insurance, should we be making societal changes through insurance companies? I guess that's also the question. Is it something the insurance industry wants to get involved with? Does it kind of meet their ethical standards and their goals? But for me, it's just because the insurance industry is so influential. You probably have so many people who can't be bothered with vaccinations or don't know about them. And by having a nudge like a discount to your premium or something like that, it might just, cause a change. And even if we prevent one person from getting cancer, that not only saves a life, it also saves millions of rands in medical bills. So, yeah, I guess that's probably where the conversation will go next. Is it something that we should be getting involved in?
Sure. Pamela, thank you so much. Again, really appreciated. Pamela, Shelley as well, thank you as well for being a part of this conversation. I think it really has been enriching for all of us to actually get first-hand perspective as well from yourself and your industry and exactly how that has played out with regards to vaccinations, whether globally or just in your life experience as well. Pamela and Shelley HELLIG, thank you so much for the time. A hot topic there.
Hot
Marie.
indeed, and well done to Pamela for bringing mom on board to this. I'm not sure I would be comfortable bringing my mom here.
Yeah, you never know how those conversations can sometimes go. But again, thank you so much to both of you. We are going to take another mindfulness moment now, of course, brought to you by Liberty. This time around, we have a bit of cardio and stretching to look forward to. Please do take these 15 minutes to perhaps clear your mind, move your body a little bit more as well. Just relax a little bit as well, especially after what seemed to have been a heated debate and discussion in our previous session now as well. After that, you might want to have a cup of tea, perhaps reflect as well on what has been discussed, some of the issues that have been raised over the past few days. And again, it's just a reminder that the game indeed does close at 12 p.m. as well today.